Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us here this morning on our last day at the photography show. It's been quite a whirlwind of activity around here, and I'm kind of excited to show you what I have this morning. This is one of my favorite parts of working with my pictures in Lightroom. I'm Nat Coalson, and my work is mainly based around fine art and travel. And I want to introduce you to the idea that if you're not doing a lot of dodging and burning or local adjustments to your photographs, then you're missing out on the chance to really make some of your pictures much more powerful and engaging for your viewers. So we're going to be looking at what are called local adjustments within Lightroom Classic. Now I should clarify real briefly here the distinction between what we're now calling Lightroom Classic CC versus the new cloud-based program that's called simply Lightroom CC. So if you've been using Lightroom for any amount of time, then Lightroom Classic is the one that you know and love, and this is the files and folders disk-based system, whereas Lightroom CC now is the cloud-based version. So this is the traditional version of Lightroom as you know it. And we'll start off by looking at what isn't technically a local adjustment, but there are a couple of tools. We're in the Develop module here now, and on the right side panels, there are a few adjustments that you can make on the panels that do have what we would consider to be a local editing application. And one of those is under the Effects panel called Post-Crop Vignetting. Now, there's a principle in photography where we always want to keep the viewer's eye well within the frame. We want the viewer's eye to move around the picture, but we don't want them going out the sides or the corners of the frame. So with this image, admittedly, it's not the sexiest picture, but it's a good example of how using some post-crop vignetting can really change the feeling of the picture. Now you'll notice in this image that the darkest area is kind of in the center of the picture, and then around the outside is lighter. We actually would prefer to inverse this, and by using the post-crop vignette, I'm darkening the corners, okay? And I would suggest that you might consider this on most of your pictures, and I do use it quite often. If we drag it all the way to the left on the amount slider, you can see that it goes full black on the corners, so you can well see the effect of it. The midpoint slider adjusts how far in you go, and then you've got controls for roundness, how round or oval it is, and then the feathering, right? If you wanted a harder edge, you can actually make quite a hard-edged effect there. So I'll just back it off a little bit here. And then if I want to lighten the middle part a little bit more, I will jump up and use the radial gradient tool. Now, a gradient, there are two types. There's a linear gradient and a radial gradient. And effectively, they start at 100% of the effect sliders that you have here, these adjustments, and then they gradually fade off to 0. So you have a start point and an end point. So with the radial gradient, then, you have the decision to make of whether or not your effects or the adjustments that you're applying, do they start in the middle and then work outward, or vice versa. So as I'm drawing out an ellipse here, you can see the edge of the mask, and I've got the exposure adjustment, and you can see that with the default setting, the effect is being applied on the outside of the mask. If we want to actually see where the mask is, I go down here onto the toolbar, and this applies to all of the local adjustments. You can hide and show the mask overlay, okay, so you can see where the effect is actually being applied. Whatever you see as red is getting the full effect of these sliders, and whatever is not red is not getting any effect, and you can see the gradient fall off here. So I'll turn this back off again. I normally work with this turned off because I would prefer just to see the effect of what I'm doing. Now, you might agree that what I'm doing here is basically the same as what I did with the post-crop vignetting tool. So what I really would prefer is that this mask is flipped or inverted. So there's a box for invert, and now you can see that the effect is being applied in the center. So if I drag, I actually wanted to increase the exposure. I'm just brightening up the middle here. And so now, effectively, what I've done is flipped around the tonality of this image where the center is lighter and the outside is darker. And I would say for most of your pictures, generally speaking, that's probably where you want to be. Again, because we're trying to keep the viewer within the frame. So I can toggle between a before and after view using the # key, or there is a before and after button down here on the toolbar. So here's before and after. So you can see that with a couple of basic adjustments, we've essentially inverted the tonal range of this picture. Okay? So another one of the develop adjustments that isn't technically a local adjustment, but it has a local application, is under the HSL panel. Okay, and HSL splits apart the components of the pixels in the image based on their hue, which is the named color range, the saturation, which is the vibrance or purity of the color, and then luminance, which is brightness. So another effect that is quite common in photo editing, especially when you've got blue skies and green grass, is to darken the skies a little bit. And so if I go down to the blue slider, again, we're on the HSL panel here, and there are 2 modes to view this, by the way. Right now I'm just looking at the luminance adjustments. You see there's 3 buttons across here. If we click all, then you see all of the HSL adjustments in one. I'll just target the luminance, and if I just want to darken the blue of the sky, I can do that very easily just by dragging this slider. Again, this is not technically a local adjustment in terms of the tools, but you can see that the effect is concentrated very much just on the blue range. And if I wanted to increase or brighten the luminance of the grass, I can do that here. There is also a targeted adjustment tool, which is kind of hard to see, but it's tucked away in the corner here. And as you activate the TAT, or Target Adjustment Tool, as I go now into the image and move my cursor around, anywhere underneath the cursor, as I click and drag, you can see the sliders over on the panel are moving based on where I have clicked and dragged. So as you are kind of getting more efficient with your workflow, you'll find that some of these adjustments are very easy to make, sort of working directly on the preview instead of just using the sliders. So you can see with a couple of quick slider adjustments and using the Target Adjustment Tool that I've dramatically changed these slider positions, and that's what's given the effect. So again, here's before and after. Right? Very simple, very quick. One other thing about these panels in the Develop module, each of them has this little switch over to the side. This is effectively an on and off switch. So if by default, it's on. If I click this switch, it turns it off. Now, technically, this is not the same as before and after, because before and after really is toggling history states. This is literally just turning the effects of this panel on and off. And you can see that all of these Develop panels have this switch. So as you're going through your developing and editing your pictures, then you can see what the effect of each of these panels really is having. Okay, so working more back to the actual local adjustments, let's try this image here. Okay, this was shot at Lake Wanaka in New Zealand, and you see the effect here of the reflection, which in most cases you'll find that when you're photographing a reflection on a lake or a pond, any sort of still body of water, that the reflection is usually 1 stop to 2 stops darker than the real sky above. And in an image like this, I would actually prefer that my upper part is almost identical to the lower part. And so I'm going to use a linear graduated filter on the sky to darken just the sky. Now, just like with the radial filter that we looked at earlier, you have a start and an end. And so wherever I click, you can just make out my cursor here in the middle of the sky. When I click and hold down and drag, you can see that I'm drawing out a gradient. Okay, and as I move my mouse side to side, you'll see that it changes the angle. Now, I should point out that you can use as many of these local adjustments as you need to edit your pictures, but you want to be efficient about it. If one will do the job, then don't use two. So one of the key ideas here, especially with darkening skies, is to try and keep it aligned to the horizon, or the horizontal plane of the image. If I hold the Shift key, then it constrains the linear graduated filter to a straight line. You see, so even as I move my mouse side to side, it's not rotating it until I go to 90 degrees, and now you can see it's locked to the vertical orientation. Okay, so that's the Shift key to constrain to 90 degrees. On many of the local adjustment tools, including the brush, the Shift key does the same thing. It constrains to a straight line. Okay, so we've got the start and the end, right? And as I've already placed this gradient over the preview image, and you can see that as I put my cursor over the start of the gradient, it turns to a hand. So I can drag and change how wide or narrow the gradient actually is. So I'll bring the gradient down maybe to about the middle, or where the reflection begins. And you can see very clearly that there is a fall off, again, where up here beyond the start position, it's getting the full effect of the adjustments, right? 100% from here all the way out to the edge of the image. Right, so if I bring it down here, you can see that the mountains are getting darkened as well. So if I bring it up a little bit now, you'll see that the 100% of the effect starts here and then is gradually tapering off to the end point. But I don't really want to darken the mountains, right? This has been kind of an issue with earlier versions of Lightroom, where if I didn't want to darken the mountains, but I want this straight linear gradient going all the way across, then I would need to make a brush and paint over to kind of counteract the effect of the adjustment. But now, with the latest release of Lightroom Classic CC, we have what's called a range mask. And a range mask is available on all of the local adjustment tools, and effectively it allows you to constrain the application of the adjustment based on either color or luminance being brightness, right? So in this case, because I only want the lighter tones up here to be affected, I'm going to use a luminance range mask. And by choosing luminance, now I have these two slider adjustments here where I can define the range. And as I drag the dark point here, you'll see that gradually the darker areas that were already dark to begin with are now not being affected by the adjustment up here. Okay, so I've constrained using these start and end points on this range slider so that only the lightest tones up above are being affected. Now we still have the issue of, you know, the gradient fall off in here. So what you're looking for ideally is a combination of placing your gradient in just the right spot and then using your range masking to further refine it. So now that I've applied this mask, again, here's another switch where you can turn your local adjustments on and off. So here's before the linear gradient, and here's after. There's another tool that has been added to Lightroom Classic over the last few releases called dehaze. And dehaze is essentially a contrast adjustment. But you can see that as I apply the dehaze adjustment within this linear gradient, then it really brings out a lot more of the detail, contrast, and texture in the sky. It's a little bit similar to clarity, if you've ever used clarity in the past, which is a mid-tone contrast adjustment. So if you really want to give more contrast and more punch to areas that are a little bit weak in their tonal range, then you might use a little bit of both clarity and vibrance. So again, here's before the adjustment and after the adjustment. Okay, very quick and simple. So you can see that, you know, within literally just a few seconds, you can correct for or balance and enhance your images using a linear gradient. So for dodging and burning, And for those of you not really familiar with this term, dodging and burning goes back to the traditional darkroom days where when you're making a print that you would add or remove light to make areas darker or lighter. So dodging is lightening and darkening is burning. We still call it dodging and burning even in the digital darkroom. And in Lightroom, the tool to do this is the local adjustment brush. Now you can see that as I switch between these three local adjustments, again we've got the linear gradient, the radial gradient, and the local adjustment brush. We essentially have the same adjustments available, but with a brush you have the additional controls for the brush size and characteristics of what you're actually painting with. Whereas the gradients are constrained by a start and an end, the brush, really, you can paint anywhere you want to. And this is a good example of a picture that can benefit a lot from some dodging and burning because we've got some distracting elements up here in the corner. Again, we want to keep the viewer's eye in the frame, but even more than that, we want to direct the viewer's eye through the picture so that the eye travels through the frame in the way that we want. So one of the first things that I would do on this image is probably jump down to the effects panel and apply a post-crop vignette, maybe bring the midpoint in a little bit. Again, here's with and without. Okay, and that gets me kind of in the direction I want to go, but not quite all the way there. So I am going to need to use a brush. And my main or first objective here is going to be to darken this area here because I find this foliage over on the side to be quite distracting. It's very high contrast. It's right at the edge of the frame. It really draws the eye out of the left side of this frame. So if I paint over this area, and again, I'll turn the mask overlay on so you can see that's the area that I've painted. And I haven't had to be very precise at all. I'm not concerned about just making a hard-edged mask around these leaves or anything like that. It's just a very soft, rough area that I've painted over. And as I decrease the exposure in that area, you can see that eventually I could go to where it's fully black, right? That's not really the effect I'm looking for. I would say in most cases, you're looking to apply local adjustments in such a way that achieves your objectives with the image, but then when somebody looks at it, it's not immediately obvious that you've darkened this and lightened this, okay? So by adjusting the exposure slider, you can see that my dark areas of the shadows are getting affected as well. So I can add a luminance range mask here and say, let's not darken the dark parts so much. Let's keep it constrained just to the lighter areas. And then I'm also going to target, instead of just doing exposure, which works on kind of the mid-range to the upper bright highlights, okay? I really want to be darkening what's already very light anyway, and so I'm going to target my adjustment mainly a little bit of whites and a little bit of highlights. And you see, as I adjust the highlights, now it's really taking those leaves down quite a bit. Okay, now the edge of this mask is looking a little bit obvious, so I'll just paint a little bit soft around here. And now this rock over here is creating a distraction, so I'll apply another brush mask for this. And I can increase and decrease the size of the brush using the bracket keys on the keyboard or by dragging the size slider here. Okay, it does the same thing. I should point out that Lightroom provides two different brush settings, and all of these, this A and B, all it really is are two different places to store settings. So normally I'll leave the A brush set with 100% feather or at level 100 feather so that it's very soft. And the B brush I will make harder, right? You can go all the way to 0 where it is a very hard edge on the brush. You can see that it's not feathered at all. If I want to delete that, then with this pin selected, I can just press delete to remove the brush. But I'll set the B brush somewhere around 50, give or take. And in general, if you look at the shape of the outline of the brush, I'll try and put it here where you can see it. There are two circles, and the two circles on the brush tip preview are showing you how much feathering there is, okay? So I'll just save my A brush as always feathered, and then I'll change the size up and down depending on how small or big I need to paint over the area. And then if I need a harder edge, I'll just go to the B brush. But in most cases, I'm never using this Automask function. The Automask attempts to identify hard edges within the picture and constrain the application of the brush mask along those edges. It's not very clean. It usually creates more problems than it solves, and in some cases, you really don't need to be so precise. And so I would encourage you mainly to use with a big soft brush and just paint over the area that you want to darken, and then use the adjustments to target what you're really trying to affect in the image, along with the range mask. But in general, I would avoid this auto mask unless you really need to paint along a very defined hard edge. Okay, so now that I have darkened the two areas, you see here's before and after. Now I want to apply another brush. I'll make a new brush, and this time I will dodge using a lightening of exposure and maybe a little bit of shadows. And I want to create more, excuse me, I want to create more of an eye line for the viewer's eye to travel within the frame. Now my vision for this image is that you will look here first and then travel down through the frame like this, eventually coming down to the bottom, hopefully not going out the bottom of the frame. So in order to accomplish that, I'm going to gently dodge or lighten the area where I want your eye to travel. Okay, so you can see with just a couple of quick brush adjustments, again, here's before and after. Okay, and again, you see how I've sort of like changed the tonal distribution of the image to keep the viewer's eye focused in where I want it to be. So let's do a couple of others here. We've got a few minutes, and then I'll be happy to take some questions. Here's an image that has a little bit of color to it. This is very close to how it was actually shot. You can see that there's some slight orange or pink color here in the sky, which is nice, but I really want to bring this out and enhance that quite a lot more. So I'll start with a basic adjustment. Now again, this is a global adjustment, but I'm going to apply a little more contrast, a little more clarity. I'll go down here to the effects panel and add some of this dehaze. I mean, look what a dramatic effect that makes. Back up to basic. And again, these aren't technically local adjustments, but I'm thinking in terms of what areas of the picture that I want to affect the most. The darks are quite dark, so I'll bring the shadows up and maybe just bump the exposure up a little bit. Okay, so here's, give it a second here. Before, oh, sorry, that was an earlier processing of the picture. I should point out here that the history, as you process a picture, the history is saved along the way, and you can go back to any point. You can also delete your local adjustments as you go, or reset the sliders, but if you changed your mind at any point and want to go back, it's all here in the history panel. Okay, so here's where we are now. And I'd like to add a little more color, so I'll use vibrance and saturation. Still, I mean, it's getting there, but it's still not quite where I want it to be. So I'm going to add a linear gradient. Again, hold the Shift key. Now I'm using it at the previous settings, which is for dodging, which I don't really want. So you can draw out your local adjustments however, wherever you want them, and then go and adjust the settings afterward. And whatever you have left here as your previous settings with the tool selected will remain until you change it. But you can change these adjustments at any point. Okay, so again, just a couple of very quick adjustments can make a huge difference. Let's work actually on this image here. Has a similar situation with the sky where I want to darken the sky. So I'll draw a linear gradient, add more contrast, maybe add some clarity and dehaze. This area in here, where the town is, I think looks a little washed out, so I'll just paint over it. Now this is just making it brighter, but I'll go in and change the settings afterwards. Bring the highlights down, reset the shadows. To reset any of the sliders to their default value, just double click on it. And then I'll bring the blacks down a little bit. Just give this a little bit more punch. Okay, so just a couple of quick adjustments. And again, if we look at, here's kind of where I started, and here's where I am now.